You can smell death approaching through the stone corridors of Pamplona's royal palace. Res, a sickly sweet odor that grows stronger with each labored breath echoing from the king's chamber. Quick favor. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. The final collapse of a king who had spent decades earning his nickname reveals how medieval medicine's desperate remedies could become instruments of unimaginable horror. October of 1386 brought the beginning of the end for Charles, II of Navarre, though few in his court dared acknowledge what their eyes told them. The man who had once terrorized French nobles through cunning and betrayal now lay propped against silk pillows, his breathing shallow and irregular. Palace servants whispered that the king had been strongly exhausted for weeks, a polite euphemism that barely concealed the reality of his rapidly failing body. Royal physicians gathered like carrion birds around their dying sovereign, their black robes rustling as they consulted ancient texts and debated treatments. These learned men, trained in the universities of Paris and Montpellier, found themselves facing the same helplessness that had plagued healers since time immemorial. Their patient was not some common merchant or peasant. This was Charles the Bad, a king whose very survival had political implications stretching from the Pyrenees to the English Channel. But what exactly was killing him? The court records speak only of mysterious exhaustion, offering no insight into whether poison, disease, or simply the accumulated stress of a lifetime spent in treacherous politics had finally claimed its due. The royal chamber became a laboratory of medieval desperation. As October faded into November, physicians prescribed bloodletting to balance his humors, applied heated cups to draw out corrupted vapors, and forced bitter herbal concoctions down his throat. None of these time-honored remedies showed the slightest effect. If anything, the king's condition worsened with each passing day, his skin taking on a waxy pallor that made courtiers cross themselves when they thought no one was watching. By December, the medical establishment had exhausted their conventional arsenal and turned to increasingly exotic treatments. They consulted astrological charts to determine the most auspicious times for intervention, burned sacred herbs to purify the air around the royal bed, and even brought in a relic of St. James, the patron saint of Spain, hoping for divine intervention. It was during these desperate final weeks that one physician proposed a treatment so unusual it would have seemed like madness in any other circumstance. Drawing upon the medical theories of the time, which held that alcohol possessed powerful warming and reviving properties, he suggested wrapping the dying king in linen cloth soaked with brandy and aqua vitae, the water of life that medieval alchemists believed contained concentrated essence of health. The logic seemed sound according to 14th century medical understanding. Charles appeared cold and lifeless, his circulation failing, and his vital spirits clearly diminished. The warming properties of distilled spirits, absorbed through his skin, might restore the balance of humors that governed life itself. At worst, the treatment would provide some comfort during his final days. What the physicians failed to consider was the extraordinary fire hazard they were creating around their helpless patient. Night after night through the bitter cold of December 1386, servants carefully soaked long strips of linen in the strongest brandy available in the royal stores. The fabric absorbed the alcohol like a wick, creating what amounted to bandages primed for combustion. These were then wrapped around the king's torso and limbs before being sewn tight to ensure the medicinal spirits remained in contact with his skin throughout the night. The procedure required meticulous attention to detail. Too little alcohol and the treatment would prove ineffective. Too much and the cloth became unwieldy, dripping spirits across the bed linens and creating an even greater fire risk. Servants learned to work quickly but carefully, their hands steady despite the knowledge that they were essentially turning their sovereign into a human torch waiting for the smallest spark. Charles himself seemed oddly peaceful during these nightly preparations, perhaps finding comfort in the warming sensation, or simply too weak to protest. Court observers noted that he rarely spoke during the final weeks, communicating mainly through gestures and occasional nods. Whether this silence reflected resignation, delirium, or simply the conservation of his remaining strength, no one could say. As December gave way to January 1387, even the most optimistic courtiers began preparing for the inevitable. The king's breathing had become increasingly labored, and periods of unconsciousness stretched longer with each passing day. His physicians maintained their alcohol treatments more from habit than hope, wrapping their patient each evening in his shroud of spirit-soaked linen. January first dawned cold and grey over Pamplona, carrying with it an atmosphere of impending conclusion. The royal chamber felt heavy with expectation as servants performed their now familiar ritual of preparing the king's medicinal wrappings. What none of them realized was that this routine procedure was about to transform from an act of healing into an instrument of the most horrific death imaginable. The stage was set for a finale that would shock even an age accustomed to brutal endings. A single loose thread dangles from the king's alcohol-soaked shroud as a servant reaches for the candle flame, unaware that this tiny imperfection will trigger the most agonizing death in royal history. This moment of careless routine would transform a sick room into an inferno, creating a spectacle so horrifying that witnesses would struggle to believe their own eyes. The servant's name has been lost to history, though her actions would echo through the centuries. She was likely a young woman, perhaps no more than 16 or 17, chosen for her steady hands and discretion. Working in the royal household meant following strict protocols, and tonight's procedure seemed no different from the dozens that had preceded it. Wrap the king in his medicinal linens, sew the fabric tight, and ensure he remained comfortable through another long night of labored breathing. The chamber itself had become a familiar scene of controlled desperation. Thick tapestries blocked the January cold, while braziers provided warmth that barely penetrated the stone walls. The air hung heavy with the scent of burning herbs, incense meant to purify the atmosphere around the dying monarch, and underneath it all, the sharp smell of brandy that had become as much a part of the room as the furniture itself. Charles lay motionless as the servant completed her work, the linen wrappings tight around his torso and arms. The fabric had absorbed an enormous quantity of alcohol, nextiate, far more than usual, as the physicians had ordered an increased dosage in hopes of stimulating some final revival. Every fiber was saturated with the potent spirits, creating what amounted to a burial shroud designed to burst into flames at the slightest provocation. But how could a routine medical treatment turn so catastrophically wrong in mere seconds? The servant noticed the loose thread as she gathered her sewing materials. It was a small thing, barely an inch long, protruding from the seam where she had finished securing the linen around the king's chest. Court protocol demanded perfection in all things touching the royal person, and leaving such an obvious flaw would have meant punishment or dismissal. Better to deal with it immediately than face questions in the morning. Contemporary chronicler Jean Froissart, whose detailed accounts provide our only window into these final moments, described what happened next with the precision of someone who had interviewed eyewitnesses while their memories remained fresh. The servant reached for the nearest candle flame, intending to singe away the offending thread with a quick touch of fire. It was a common technique used by seamstresses and tailors throughout Europe to clean up minor imperfections in fabric work. The thread ignited instantly. As expected, what the servant had not anticipated was how quickly the flame would race along the alcohol-soaked linen, following invisible paths of brandy that had seeped beyond the intended boundaries. Within heartbeats, the medicinal wrappings had become a web of fire spreading across the king's body with terrifying speed. Charles, despite his weakened condition, became immediately and horribly aware of his situation. The flames brought a surge of adrenaline that cut through weeks of semi-consciousness, and his screams filled the chamber with a sound that servants would hear in their nightmares for years to come. The fire consumed the linen wrappings first, then began working on the silk nightclothes beneath, and finally reached the king's skin itself. Froissart recorded the scene with characteristic medieval fatalism, writing that the fire had caught by the pleasure of God or of the devil. This phrase reveals how witnesses interpreted the disaster, not as an accident of medicine gone wrong, but as divine intervention, perhaps judgment for a lifetime of political scheming and betrayal. The servant's initial shock gave way to frantic action as she tried to beat out the flames with her bare hands, but the fire had already spread too far and burned too hot. Other attendants rushed into the chamber, but their attempts at rescue only fanned the flames higher. Water might have helped, but the nearest source was down a long corridor, and by the time anyone could have fetched it, the damage was already irreversible. What made the scene even more nightmarish was Charles's continued consciousness throughout much of the ordeal. Unlike victims of house fires who often succumb quickly to smoke inhalation, the king remained aware and screaming as the flames consumed first his clothing, then his flesh. The alcohol that was supposed to heal him had instead created a perfect accelerant, ensuring the fire burned with unusual intensity and heat. Palace guards eventually succeeded in extinguishing the flames, but the damage was catastrophic. The king, who had once commanded armies and negotiated with monarchs across Europe, now lay burned beyond recognition, his body a testament to the unforgiving brutality of medieval medicine. Yet somehow, impossibly, he was still breathing. The real horror was only beginning. Charles the Bad would not die quickly. The acrid stench of burned flesh mingles with medicinal herbs as royal physicians stare helplessly at their patient, a king transformed into a living nightmare of charred skin and exposed bone. The survival of Charles the Bad, beyond those first horrific moments, would force everyone present to confront the true limits of both medical knowledge and human endurance. The immediate aftermath of the fire revealed a scene that challenged every witness's capacity for comprehension. Charles lay conscious but unrecognizable, his body a patchwork of burns ranging from first-degree redness to areas where flesh had been completely consumed, exposing underlying muscle and bone. The alcohol-fed flames had burned with such intensity that even his hair and eyebrows had been singed away, leaving his face a grotesque mask of blistered skin and weeping wounds. Royal physician Master Guillaume immediately took charge of the crisis, though his training had provided no guidance for treating burns of this severity. Medieval medical theory held that fire damage resulted from an excess of hot, dry humors, requiring treatment with cooling, moist remedies. Within minutes, servants were rushing to prepare poultices of egg whites, honey, and crushed herbs, traditional burn treatments that seemed pathetically inadequate given the scale of destruction before them. The king's survival presented an immediate political crisis alongside the medical emergency. Word of the accident could not be contained within the palace walls, and by dawn, rumors were already spreading through Pamplona's narrow streets. Some whispered of assassination, others of divine judgment, but all recognized that Navarre's stability hung in the balance. Charles had no clear heir of age, and his death would trigger a succession crisis that could invite intervention from France or Castile. But could any human being possibly survive injuries this catastrophic? And if so, for how long? The burns covered approximately 60% of Charles's body, with the worst damage concentrated on his torso, where the alcohol-soaked linen had been most thoroughly saturated. His arms and legs showed varying degrees of injury, with some areas remaining relatively unscathed, while others displayed bone and sinew through gaps in destroyed skin. Most disturbing of all was his continued consciousness, when sighs, the king could see, hear, and speak, making him fully aware of his transformed condition. Medieval understanding of burn treatment relied heavily on preventing infection and maintaining moisture in damaged tissue. Physicians applied thick layers of rendered animal fat mixed with healing herbs, then wrapped the worst areas in clean linen bandages. These treatments provided some pain relief, but they also created ideal conditions for the bacterial infections that would prove equally deadly in an age before antibiotics. Charles's voice, when he could manage to speak, had been damaged by inhaling superheated air during the fire. His words came out as harsh whispers, punctuated by coughing fits that brought up blood and charred tissue from his throat and lungs. The few coherent statements recorded by court scribes revealed a man struggling to understand how his carefully orchestrated medical treatment had transformed into unimaginable agony. The psychological trauma proved as devastating as the physical injuries. Charles had spent his entire adult life as a master manipulator, using intelligence and cunning to outmaneuver enemies across Europe. Now he found himself completely helpless, dependent on others for every basic need, while enduring pain that pushed the boundaries of human tolerance. Court observers noted periods when the king seemed to retreat into catatonic silence, perhaps his mind's desperate attempt to escape an unbearable reality. Palace routine ground to a halt as the crisis consumed everyone's attention. Normally bustling corridors fell silent, except for the hurried footsteps of physicians and servants rushing between the royal chamber and the makeshift medical preparation areas that had sprung up throughout the palace. The smell of burning herbs and medicinal preparations could not quite mask the underlying odor of infected wounds that grew stronger with each passing hour. How could medieval medicine possibly address injuries that would challenge even modern trauma centers? By the second day, signs of systemic infection were becoming apparent. Charles developed a high fever that left him delirious for hours at a time, speaking to long-dead relatives and issuing orders to armies that existed only in his damaged mind. His skin took on a grayish pallor, broken only by the angry red of infected burn sites. Most ominously, the wounds began producing a thick, foul-smelling discharge that physicians recognized as a sign of deep corruption in the body's humors. The medical team expanded to include specialists summoned from across the kingdom. A master surgeon arrived from Paris, bringing with him techniques for treating battle wounds that might apply to burn injuries. A renowned herbalist from the mountains contributed rare plants said to possess extraordinary healing properties. Even a Jewish physician, despite the religious tensions of the era, was quietly consulted for his knowledge of ancient Greek medical texts. None of their efforts seemed to make any meaningful difference. If anything, Charles's condition continued to deteriorate as infections spread through his damaged tissue. The burns that had initially appeared survivable were now clearly becoming septic, poisoning his blood and overwhelming his body's natural defenses. Yet, still the king clung to life with a tenacity that amazed and horrified his attendants. The political implications of his prolonged suffering could not be ignored much longer. Whispered conversations echo through palace corridors as courtiers debate whether their burning king represents divine punishment or political opportunity, while neighboring kingdoms watched Navarre's agony with calculating eyes. The prolonged spectacle of royal suffering was creating dangerous instabilities that threatened to tear apart not just Charles's kingdom, but the delicate balance of power across medieval Europe. The question of succession dominated every hushed conversation in Pamplona's halls of power. Charles's heir apparent, his son Carlos, remained a child, far too young to rule effectively in an era when personal strength and political cunning determined survival. The prospect of a regency government appealed to no one, least of all the neighboring monarchs who had spent decades locked in complex alliances and enmities with Charles the Bad. French King Charles VI received hourly updates on his dying rival's condition through a network of spies embedded deep within the Navarre's court. For years, the two Charles had engaged in an intricate dance of warfare and diplomacy, with the Navarre's king alternately supporting and betraying French interests depending on which approach served his immediate needs. Now France faced the possibility of either installing a puppet ruler in Navarre or dealing with complete political chaos along a crucial border region. Castilian observers proved equally attentive to developments across the Pyrenees. King Juan I had his own claims to portions of Navarre's territory, claims that might prove easier to press against a child ruler than they had been against the notoriously cunning Charles. Castilian merchants in Pamplona's markets reported back to their sovereign with detailed accounts of the palace's atmosphere, noting which nobles seemed most likely to support foreign intervention and which might resist. But how could any political calculation account for a king who refused to die despite injuries that should have killed him within hours? The English court, though geographically distant, maintained keen interest in Navarre's affairs through their ongoing conflicts with France. Charles the Bad had occasionally served as a useful ally in English efforts to destabilize French power, and his potential replacement might prove less amenable to such arrangements. English agents discreetly offered medical assistance, ostensibly humanitarian but actually designed to gather intelligence about the succession crisis. Within Navarre itself, the prolonged royal agony was creating unprecedented tensions among the nobility. Traditional court ceremonies had become impossible to maintain when the king existed in a state between life and death, unable to perform the ritual functions that legitimized royal authority. Some nobles quietly suggested that mercy demanded hastening Charles's end, while others insisted that only God could determine the moment of a sovereign's death. The clergy found themselves in an especially difficult position. Church doctrine held that suicide was among the gravest sins, making any active intervention to end the king's suffering spiritually dangerous. Yet watching Charles endure what many interpreted as divine punishment raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and mercy. Archbishop Pedro delivered carefully worded sermons about accepting God's will, while privately struggling with whether pastoral duty required advocating for relief from unbearable pain. Palace servants, who witnessed the daily reality of their master's condition, developed their own underground network of whispered assessments and predictions. These men and women, invisible to the political machinations swirling above them, possessed the most accurate understanding of Charles's actual state. They knew which treatments provided temporary relief, which hours of the day brought the worst episodes of pain, and most importantly, they could see that recovery was impossible. What moral obligations did subjects owe to a ruler whose suffering had become a public spectacle? The economic costs of maintaining the elaborate medical effort were becoming substantial. Rare herbs and medicines arrived daily from across Europe, their prices inflated by the urgent demand and the kingdom's obvious desperation. Master physicians commanded enormous fees for their consultations, despite their obvious inability to provide meaningful relief. The royal treasury, already strained by years of military campaigns and political intrigues, faced additional pressure at precisely the moment when political stability demanded shows of strength and abundance. International diplomatic correspondence from early 1387 reveals how Charles's prolonged dying process was affecting broader European politics. Papal representatives wrote detailed reports about the theological implications of a ruler who seemed to be experiencing divine judgment in real time. These documents would later influence church doctrine about the relationship between earthly power and spiritual authority. though their immediate impact was to create uncertainty about Navarre's international standing. Perhaps most troubling for those closest to the situation was the king's continued mental awareness throughout much of his ordeal. During lucid moments, Charles could understand and respond to questions about affairs of state, creating the surreal situation of conducting royal business with a man whose body was systematically failing. These conversations often focused on succession arrangements and final instructions, but they were frequently interrupted by episodes of delirium or overwhelming pain. The medical team faced an impossible dilemma between their oath to preserve life and their recognition that their patient's condition would only worsen. Master Guillaume found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about the healer's role when healing had become impossible, and continued treatment seemed to prolong suffering rather than alleviate it. As January progressed toward its end, even the most optimistic observers had to acknowledge that Charles the Bad was dying by degrees, creating a crisis that would soon demand resolution regardless of political convenience. The royal chamber falls silent, except for the wet, rattling breaths of a king whose burned lungs struggle with each inhalation, while courtiers count the hours until Navarre's nightmare finally ends. This prolonged death watch would establish Charles the Bad's final legacy, not as a master politician, but as a cautionary tale about the horrific consequences of medieval medical hubris. By late January 1387, even the most dedicated physicians had begun to step back from active treatment. The king's condition had deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery, with massive infections spreading through his burned tissue and overwhelming his body's remaining defenses. What had begun as an accident had transformed into a slow-motion catastrophe that seemed to stretch endlessly through the winter days. Charles's breathing had become labored and irregular, often stopping entirely for terrifying moments before resuming with harsh, gasping sounds that echoed through the stone corridors. His fever spiked unpredictably, sending him into delirium, where he relived battles from decades past or conducted animated conversations with courtiers who had died years earlier. During these episodes, his voice would strengthen temporarily, giving false hope to attendants who had grown accustomed to his weak whispers. The burns themselves had evolved into a geography of horror that challenged every observer's composure. Areas that had initially appeared survivable had become necrotic, with dead tissue peeling away to reveal infected wounds beneath. The medicinal wrappings required constant changing, a process that involved carefully cleaning away discharged fluids and reapplying herbal poultices that provided minimal comfort. Each dressing change triggered fresh waves of agony that left the king unconscious or delirious for hours afterward. How could human flesh endure such systematic destruction while consciousness persisted? Palace servants had developed carefully orchestrated routines to manage the practical challenges of caring for their dying sovereign. Teams worked in shifts to maintain the braziers that kept the chamber warm, replace soiled linens, and prepare the constant stream of medications that physicians continued to prescribe despite their obvious futility. The logistics of royal care had become a complex operation involving dozens of people, all sworn to secrecy about the true extent of their master's condition. The smell of death had become inescapable throughout the royal quarters. Burning herbs and expensive perfumes could no longer mask the underlying odor of infected wounds and bodily decay. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths when approaching the king's chamber, and many developed chronic headaches from the constant assault on their senses. Even the thick stone walls seemed to have absorbed the smell, making it impossible to escape entirely. Master Guillaume, exhausted by weeks of futile effort, finally acknowledged what everyone already knew, but dared not speak aloud. The king was beyond any earthly help, and continued treatment served only to prolong his suffering without offering any possibility of recovery. This admission marked a turning point in the death watch, shifting focus from healing to providing whatever comfort remained possible during the final stages. Charles himself seemed increasingly aware of his approaching end. During rare moments of clarity, he would gesture weakly toward specific courtiers, attempting to communicate final instructions or farewells. His voice had been reduced to barely audible whispers, forcing attendants to lean close to his burned lips to catch fragments of words. These conversations often centered on arrangements for his burial, particularly his desire to have his body divided among 3 sacred sites, according to medieval custom. The psychological toll on those forced to witness the king's prolonged agony was becoming apparent in subtle changes throughout the palace hierarchy. Servants who had worked efficiently for years began making small mistakes or forgetting routine duties. Guards standing watch outside the royal chamber showed signs of stress and sleeplessness. Even hardened nobles, accustomed to the brutalities of medieval warfare, found themselves avoiding the king's presence whenever possible. What did it mean for a kingdom when its sovereign's death became a source of relief rather than mourning? International observers continued to monitor developments, but their focus had shifted from succession planning to simple, morbid fascination with the spectacle itself. The story of Charles the Bad's fiery accident was spreading through European courts, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of experimental medicine and the unpredictable nature of divine justice. Foreign ambassadors sent increasingly detailed reports to their sovereigns, documenting not just the political implications, but the gruesome medical details that made the story so compelling. The end, when it finally came, arrived with surprising swiftness after weeks of gradual decline. On the morning of January 31st, 1387, palace attendants noticed that the king's breathing had become even more labored than usual. His fever had spiked to dangerous levels, and he remained unconscious despite all attempts to rouse him. Master Guillaume, summoned urgently to the bedside, recognized the signs of final systemic collapse. Within hours, Charles the Bad would achieve the release that had eluded him for nearly a month of unimaginable suffering. The last breath escapes Charles's burned lips as dawn breaks over Pamplona on January 1st, 1387, finally ending a night of agony that would echo through European memory for centuries. The moment of death brought immediate relief to witnesses who had endured hours of watching their sovereign suffer. But it also triggered a carefully orchestrated cover-up designed to preserve royal dignity. The fire had consumed Charles the Bad in a matter of minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours for everyone forced to witness the catastrophe. Contemporary chronicler Jean Froissart, whose detailed account provides the only reliable record of these final moments, described how the king's screams gradually weakened as shock and smoke inhalation began to overwhelm his system. The flames had burned with such intensity that even after they were extinguished, the heat radiating from his body prevented anyone from approaching for several crucial minutes. Master Guillaume reached the king's side first, though his medical training offered no guidance for injuries of this magnitude. Charles remained conscious, but unable to speak coherently, his vocal cords damaged by inhaling superheated air during the fire. His eyes, though burned and swollen, still showed awareness of his surroundings, a mercy or curse that trapped him in full knowledge of his transformed condition. The physician's immediate priority became pain management rather than treatment, since recovery was clearly impossible. He administered the strongest opiates available in the royal stores, hoping to provide some relief during whatever time remained. These medieval painkillers, derived from poppy extracts and other plant-based compounds, offered limited effectiveness against trauma of this severity, but they represented the only compassionate option available. How could anyone have anticipated that a routine medical treatment would transform into the most horrific royal death in recorded history? Palace protocol demanded that witnesses remain present to verify the king's final moments, despite the traumatic nature of the scene. Archbishop Pedro arrived to administer last rites, though the traditional ceremonies had to be adapted for a sovereign who could no longer speak audibly. The archbishop leaned close to Charles's burned face, listening for whispered confessions or final declarations that might clarify succession arrangements or provide spiritual comfort. The servants who had been present during the accident found themselves central figures in an unfolding crisis that extended far beyond the medical emergency. Their testimony would be crucial for establishing the official account of events, particularly regarding whether the fire represented an accident, assassination attempt, or divine intervention. Palace officials immediately began questioning each witness separately, ensuring their stories remained consistent while identifying any details that might prove politically damaging. Charles's final hours passed in a haze of administered opiates and growing physiological collapse. The burns had triggered massive fluid loss and systemic shock that overwhelmed his body's capacity for recovery. His breathing became increasingly irregular as his cardiovascular system struggled to maintain circulation through damaged tissue. Yet somehow, his consciousness persisted, creating the nightmarish situation of a dying king who remained aware of his condition until nearly the end. The political implications of the king's manner of death created immediate challenges for court officials responsible for managing the succession crisis. Charles the Bad had earned his nickname through decades of political scheming, warfare, and betrayal that had made him numerous enemies across Europe. Many observers would interpret his fiery death as divine punishment for a lifetime of sins, a narrative that could destabilize the entire kingdom if it gained widespread acceptance. Foreign ambassadors present in Pamplona faced delicate decisions about how to report the catastrophe to their sovereigns. The truth that a medical treatment had accidentally incinerated the king seemed almost too bizarre to believe, yet the evidence was undeniable. Some diplomatic correspondence from this period shows attempts to find alternative explanations that might seem more politically palatable, including speculation about assassination plots or supernatural intervention. What would history make of a king who died through medical incompetence rather than battlefield glory or political intrigue? As January 1st progressed toward its conclusion, Charles's vital signs continued to deteriorate, despite all efforts to stabilize his condition. His pulse became weak and thready, his breathing shallow and irregular. The infections spreading through his burned tissue were overwhelming his immune system, creating the septic conditions that would ultimately prove fatal. Master Guillaume recognized the signs of impending death and began preparing the court for the inevitable conclusion. The king's final conscious moments came as evening shadows lengthened across his chamber. According to witnesses, he attempted to speak, but could only produce weak gestures that courtiers interpreted as attempts to give final instructions. His eyes remained alert until nearly the end, creating an eerie sense that his mind remained trapped within a body that had become uninhabitable. Charles the Bad died sometime before midnight on January 1st, 1387, surrounded by the smell of burned flesh and the whispered prayers of attendants who had watched their sovereign transformed from political mastermind to object of pity within the span of a single day. The immediate aftermath would prove as dramatic as the death itself, as palace officials scrambled to control both the political narrative and the physical evidence of what had occurred. The charred remains of Europe's most notorious schemer are hastily prepared for burial as palace officials work frantically to transform a medical disaster into a dignified royal death narrative. The final chapter of Charles the Bad's life would prove that even in death, political calculation could reshape the most horrific realities into acceptable public mythology. Within hours of the king's death, A carefully orchestrated campaign began to control both the physical evidence and the historical narrative of what had occurred. Palace servants who had witnessed the accident found themselves bound by increasingly strict oaths of silence, while officials worked to ensure that only the most sanitized version of events would reach the public. The truth that their sovereign had been accidentally incinerated during a medical treatment seemed too absurd and undignified to acknowledge openly. Master Guillaume faced the grim task of preparing Charles's remains for burial according to the elaborate instructions laid out in the king's 1385 testament. Medieval royal burial customs demanded the division of the corpse among multiple sacred sites, a practice that reflected both religious devotion and political strategy. Charles had specified that his body should rest in Notre-Dame de Pamplona, his heart in Notre-Dame du Jouet, and his entrails in the shrine at Roncevaux. This tripartite burial arrangement, common among medieval nobility, presented extraordinary challenges given the condition of the king's fire-damaged remains. The physician and his assistants worked behind closed doors, using techniques developed for battlefield casualties to separate and preserve the required portions. The process required exceptional skill to maintain the dignity expected for royal remains while dealing with tissue that had been severely compromised by burns and subsequent infection. How could courtiers transform such a grotesque accident into a death worthy of royal commemoration? The embalming process itself became an exercise in damage control as much as preservation. Medieval techniques relied heavily on aromatic herbs and spices to mask the odor of decay, but Charles's burned flesh presented unique challenges that pushed these methods to their limits. Multiple layers of costly perfumed wrappings were required to contain both the smell and the visual evidence of his traumatic end. Palace chroniclers began crafting the official account that would enter historical records, carefully balancing the need for accuracy with the demands of royal dignity. Their version acknowledged the fire, but emphasized the medical treatment rather than dwelling on the horrific details of the king's suffering. This sanitized narrative would become the foundation for later historical accounts, though it left many questions unanswered about the specific circumstances of the accident. The political transition proceeded with remarkable smoothness, despite the traumatic nature of Charles's death. His son, now Charles III of Navarre, inherited the crown without significant opposition from either domestic nobles or foreign powers. This peaceful succession surprised many observers who had expected the bizarre circumstances of the king's death to trigger a succession crisis or foreign intervention. International reaction to news of Charles's death revealed the complex mixture of shock, fascination, and moral interpretation that would characterize European memory of the event. French courtiers privately expressed satisfaction at the demise of their longtime rival, while publicly offering appropriate condolences to the Navarrese royal family. Castilian observers focused primarily on the political opportunities created by the transition to a younger, less experienced ruler. The papal response proved particularly significant in shaping how the death would be remembered. Church officials, while offering masses for Charles's soul, could not resist drawing moral lessons from his fiery end. Sermons delivered across Europe in the months following his death emphasized themes of divine justice and the dangers of excessive pride, transforming the accident into a cautionary tale about the limits of earthly power. What did it mean when a king's death became a source of moral instruction rather than national mourning? Jean Froissart's detailed chronicle of the event ensured that accurate information about the accident would survive alongside the sanitized official accounts. His description of the fire, while brief, captured both the horror of the moment and the broader implications for understanding royal mortality. Froissart's phrase about the fire catching by the pleasure of God or of the devil became particularly influential in establishing the theological framework through which later generations would interpret the event. The story of Charles the Bad's death spread rapidly through European courts, carried by diplomatic correspondence, merchant networks, and traveling clergy. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of the tale. Some focused on the medical malpractice, others on the divine judgment interpretation, and still others on the political lessons about the fragility of royal power. This multiplication of narratives ensured the story's survival, while also demonstrating how historical events could be reshaped to serve various purposes. Popular memory proved especially drawn to the moralistic interpretation of Charles's fate. The king, who had earned his nickname through political treachery and betrayal, had died in circumstances that seemed to embody perfect poetic justice. This narrative satisfaction helped establish the story as a staple of European folklore, where it would persist long after the specific political context had been forgotten. The physical locations where Charles's remains were interred became minor pilgrimage sites, though more for their connection to the dramatic story than for any religious significance. Visitors to Notre Dame de Pamplona would often inquire about the tomb of the king who burned to death, demonstrating how the manner of his demise had overshadowed his political achievements in popular consciousness. Modern historians, studying Charles the Bad's death, face the challenge of separating reliable facts from centuries of accumulated legend and moral interpretation. While the basic outline of events seems well established through contemporary sources like Froissart, many details have been embellished or distorted by later chroniclers who found the story too compelling to leave unadorned. The medical aspects of the case continue to fascinate scholars interested in the history of medieval healing practices. Charles's death represents one of the most dramatic examples of how period treatments could prove more dangerous than the conditions they were meant to address. The alcohol-soaked wrappings that killed him reflected state-of-the-art medical thinking, making his death a perfect illustration of the gap between medieval medical theory and practical safety. Perhaps most significantly, Charles the Bad's fiery end established a template for how sudden royal deaths could be interpreted through moral and theological lenses. Future generations would look to his example when seeking to understand why monarchs died in particularly dramatic or unexpected circumstances, using his story as evidence that earthly power offered no protection against divine judgment. The king, who had spent his life manipulating political narratives to serve his purposes, ultimately became the subject of the most enduring narrative he never controlled, the story of his own horrific death.